So I will introduce you. All right, hello and welcome to the final program on the stage at the American Writers Festival. We're wrapping up our programs today by talking about some of the most important issues being tackled in young adult literature. Book banning, censorship, peer pressure, addiction, and many other topics are tackled in Jas Hammonds' Thirsty and Samira Ahmed's This Book Won't Burn, and we're thrilled to welcome them both. So,
Hi, Jas.
Hi.
Jas is at the end of their tour.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. As well as you.
Yeah, I am too.
These books both just came out recently, so very excited to be celebrating with each other and with you all. So thank you all so much for coming out. I think technically the topic was the state of YA literature today.
So we're each going to give a speech.
about,
just on this small topic.
yeah.
I think we'll talk about our books a little bit and then talk a little bit about some of these issues in YA and publishing. And we also hope to take questions.
Yes.
And I love when people just yell questions at me. I'm not even
What's the
joking.
meaning of life?
I love that you started with a softball question. Thank you. But yeah, so seriously, if there's something that we say that sparks some curiosity in you, please just go ahead. We, as you can tell, we're kind of casual
Yes.
on things, and I think we can have a fun conversation. So please think of those questions to be able.
But I think we were just going to start off by telling you a little bit about our books that we are here for. That might be helpful to know. And I'm going to start. And I'm here with my book Thirsty. It is my second YA novel, and it is about a girl named Blake Brenner who is about to enter her freshman year of college. And the summer before she enters college, she is trying to gain admittance into this elite secret society. And she quickly discovers the pledge process is a wild ride, and some issues with drinking come up, and she's like rediscovering her relationship with her long-term girlfriend. And so it is I call this my hot mess book. Truly, it is.
Blake, totally.
She is a hot mess, and just as a side note,
But in a lovable way.
in a lovable hot mess. I actually stole this idea from Samira, so thank you so much. Is that I noticed that she had people sign her copy of the book. So afterwards, if you want to come up and sign my copy
And mine.
and Samira's, that would be really wonderful and special. Because
Yes, that's our memento. It's like our souvenirs
it
from our
is.
travels.
It is, and so I went.
No purchase necessary.
No purchase necessary. Just come and see us afterwards, and that would mean a lot to us. So thank you all so much for having me.
Yes, I'm excited to talk about Thirsty, and I love titles that can mean multiple things. So my book is called This Book Won't Burn, which can also mean multiple things. The physical copy itself will burn, so we're not going to try that. I mean, we're like a metaphor. But This Book Won't Burn is about this young woman, Noor. She's a 17-year-old, and she's going through some family trauma because her father has essentially abandoned the family. And this makes her mom kind of really retreat into herself, and they're all suffering from this kind of trauma. And the mom moves Noor and her little sister from Chicago to a small town in southern Illinois that is like the polar opposite of Chicago. And for Noor, one of the places that she always loves to go at her school in Chicago was the library, because she was like one of those library kids. You know, are there library kids in here? Yes! She was one of those library helpers, and you know, like me, maybe she would have told the librarian if something was misshelved. And so the library is kind of the space that she and her friends would also just hang out. Because, you know, librarians now are working so hard to make libraries inclusive spaces, hangout spaces. It's a place where you can get a book, but it's also a place where you can just be welcome. But in this new small town, she finds that over 500 books are being pulled from the shelves, and they're almost all books by queer or BIPOC authors. And even though it's her senior year and she just wants to put her head down and get through the year after all this terrible stuff has happened to her, she knows she cannot keep quiet about these books being pulled from library shelves, because she knows that when people are banning books, they're really erasing identities. They're really saying your stories don't belong on our shelves. And so she just cannot keep quiet about it. And even though it's essentially putting her like on a path of confrontation with some powers that be in her small community, like the school board president, who really, really don't like her.
Yeah. And I loved reading your book because I think that YA for the past couple of years is like almost like afraid to allow, like, especially girls, the opportunity to just be messy and like make mistakes and mad. And I love that Nora is a character who is incredibly angry from the very the very beginning of the book. So do you want to talk about just
angry girls?
Angry girls.
Yes.
And
I love anger. Personally, I'm an Aries, so like fire and rage like perfectly fit with me. Are you an Aries also?
I'm not, but do you like your Mercury sign can affect you?
Oh.
So like if your Mercury sign was Pisces, then you'd be more sensitive than the normal Arian.
Oh, I don't know what that is, but I will look it up.
Mercury sign is like your sign that's next to your sun sign.
Okay.
I'm assuming it's the main sign. I'm really confused.
Okay, I will know what it is for myself, but thank you. Thank you for telling me that. So I like writing about anger because I think anger can actually be a motivator, and I guess it has been in my life a lot.
Same.
Same for you. How do you use it as a motivator?
I think I'm petty, and I like doing things that people, it's like.
Were you that way in high school too?
Secretly, like I wasn't like boastful, but like I was that person in the corner that was like, okay, yeah, you sleeping on me now, but like watch me, and I would like go do the things, and so yeah, I love just the pettiness of that and how that can just. Whatever works, you know?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think also, like, the anger of young women is so often either, like, brushed aside or considered unimportant, or it's considered, like, oh, well, you're just being hysterical, or you're being overly dramatic, or something like that. And it's something that it really makes me angry when I hear that, because I think it's so important for us as adults, especially when we're seeing this evidence in our young people, to examine why that is, to confront why that is. Because so much for like our characters, there's a lot of pressures being put upon them. There's a lot of unfairness acted out upon them.
And I don't know if you relate to this because you've been in the industry longer than I have, but
That's just a nice way of saying I'm.
No, that is not. Yeah. But I don't know if you have seen, because I was in conversation with another author while I was on tour this week, and they mentioned that there's been a lot of moralization of teenagers lately, and how that teenagers aren't allowed that space to be messy, and you feel like they have to be perfect in order to give them to teenagers, and I feel like it's almost counterintuitive because
it's ridiculous.
Yeah, like when I was a teenager, making these mistakes and having the luxury to make a mistake and not like it's the end of the world. But I don't know. Have you seen that trend?
I mean. It's like your cerebral cortex isn't even fully formed yet. Like, just give kids a break. Because this is your second book. So your first one was 2022. Okay, so my first book was 2018. This is my 7th book. And I feel like I've seen more of a rise in critique of, and it's always from adult reviewers. This teen made a lot of bad decisions. I was like, have you ever been a teenager? As an adult, as a middle-aged adult, I will say adults also make bad decisions. And in fact, a lot of our books, so much writing, I think, especially in contemporary, is about young people having to react to decisions that have been forced upon them by quote-unquote well-meaning adults. And I think, I feel like maybe it's gone kind of hand in hand with the increase in censorship and book banning in that's rampant really in the US. I mean, I know here in Chicago we haven't had to deal with it in the same way. We have a governor and a secretary of state who tried to pass, laws to prevent it from happening. But I definitely feel like there is this attempt to impose a kind of morality on young adult literature that I just think is really wrong and unfair. I mean, books should challenge you. Books should make you uncomfortable at times. Books should make you question things.
Yeah.
But how's it been? Because this is just your second book, so it's a tough time to come into the industry.
Yeah. I feel like a wee little baby. And I think for my first book, my debut, We Deserve Monuments.
Please, everyone read that book. Awesome book.
My main character in that book, she was, that chart that's like neutral good, lawful good. Okay, she was just lawful good. Like she was just trying her best and just was, I just want to make everybody happy. And I think that was just a natural thing that happened because I was like, oh, this is my first book and I don't want to, you're afraid of critique and you're afraid of like pushback. So I think naturally you're trying to make these people likable. And that even like, I realized like when I was looking back on it, I'm like, oh, even like the awful people, they're like still kind of likable. And so when I was writing Thirsty, and Blake is a main character who just makes some really bad
right off the bat, literally.
Right
no
off the
spoilers,
bat.
but literally, I think it's chapter 1.
It's chapter 1
Yeah.
where she throws a bucket of paint across somebody's yacht. Like she's just that person, and I
basically on a dare, kind of.
It's just like kind of like, oh yeah, you don't like
this
this guy. Like, what are you gonna do about it? And nobody even told her to do this. She was like, oh, I'll tell you what it was her idea. So I'm like, that is the kind of person that she is. And so writing that messiness was really scary for me because I'm like, my first main character was so likable and so lovable and people had very little complaints about her.
Yeah.
I also don't read reviews, which I don't know.
It's a good idea.
Are there authors in the audience?
Don't read Amazon.
Don't
reviews.
read
Goodreads. Oh my gosh, no, don't.
But like when I talk with people about that book, most people are like, "Oh, I love Avery. She's so sweet." And so like doing it the second time, where I do have a character who does make these really tough decisions, and I'm like, "Oh, people are gonna hate her. They're not gonna like her." And especially if you have never dealt with like insecurity issues or self-esteem issues, and you're not going to understand where she's coming from. I think that was really scary for me.
For you to write as a writer.
For me to write about it because it was also like a reflection of me because I was writing this book when I was exploring my own relationship with alcohol, and I'm 4.5 years sober, and I wrote this book like in the first 30 days. So a lot of this book feels like my diary. And also, it was kind of like when people are critiquing Blake, they are going to be critiquing me.
Yeah, so it feels close to the bone.
Exactly, and so that was really hard. And I think because this book is like 4 days old at this point, I still don't really know how I'm going to handle that when I do get people who are like, oh, she's so annoying. Why would she do this? And I'm like.
There will definitely 100% be people who tell you that. Like, and it's not just in the Amazon reviews. They will literally come and tell you to your face.
Yes.
Which is weird. Always a weird experience when that happens. I think that's interesting because as the old person on the stage, for me, I feel like once the book is out, I have a separation from the book.
Yeah.
And I think it's because even when, like, for example, this book was also inspired by just a story, like something that happened to me, because my books have been banned. And about 3 years ago, an English teacher in a small rural district in Kansas came to me to tell me that she was trying to teach Internment, my second novel, in literary circles in her classroom. And she taught in a almost all-white small rural district, and 2 other teachers objected to having it be on the curriculum. And they said, we don't think this book should be taught here. And the reason they gave her when she asked was, well, there's no South Asian or Muslim students at the school. And I was like, this is always my response, which is like, but you probably have Lord of the Rings and you're not teaching the hobbits. And 1,000%, like, you've got dragon books in your library, but I don't see any dragons in the classroom right now. But this teacher also told me that she was scared to really question because she'd never had gotten this kind of pushback from her colleagues. And she also told me that she is she's a single mom and she's the primary wage earner in our house, and she was literally scared of either being fired or being, you don't want to get like the attention of the school board and superintendent in that way. And then she said to me, but I also don't want to just kind of cop out or give up, so how can I be brave, she asked me. And that's the question that led to this book. And I think that's a question like a lot of artists, when you're putting this book out, it's a question you're asking yourself, like, I want to write this book, and especially when we're writing books about imperfect characters, and especially like imperfect girls. I think that comes up. Yeah.
Along with that, have you found in conversation with other authors or that publishers or editors or agents are kind of afraid and looking for things that are more conventional because of these book ban pushes, and they don't want to have something out there that might get banned?
Did everyone hear that question? Okay, do you want to?
Yes. I will say that my debut novel, when we were trying to sell it, it was hard to sell that book, and I was not prepared for that. Like, I mean, going on submission to editors is just terrifying in general, but when you have a Black queer girl who is just like in this messy family and there's like intergenerational trauma and blah blah blah, I was like, oof. We're like, it was really scary. And I had editors who were like, this is too controversial, who said that in their rejection to me, who were like, they didn't want to touch it.
Yeah.
And it really took an editor who was like, I see what you're trying to do here, and yeah, it's just like a matter of finding the people on your team that are like, I believe in this, and I believe that it is a story that needs to be told. But it was really rough. It took almost a year to sell my debut novel, to the point where I was going to shelve it and just.
Glad you didn't. I think that's definitely been an issue that's been not just in the last year or two, but that my first book went on sub in 2016. And that's Loving and Other Filters. And when that went on sub, and even Internment, my second book, I got a lot of notes from editors who had maybe were trying to take it to acquisitions, or they had questions. My first book deals with Islamophobia, and it was the same thing. There were concerns about addressing Islamophobia in both of those books, and whether the books were too political. And for Internment, literally, one of the editors was like, I really love this book, but marketing had some concerns about how to market the book and also where to place it in the bookstore. And I was like, but the other books in the bookstore, that has a lot of books. But that's definitely been something that I think we've definitely seen in the last couple of years, and I think that's really reflected in the bestseller lists right now. And if you look at the New York Times bestseller list right now, when I was like coming up, like 2018, 2019, 2020, or between 2017 to like maybe 2020 before COVID, it was this kind of, there was like this, I think of it as like a renaissance in young people's literature, because thanks to the work of like We Need Diverse Books and other, people or organizations like this, the bestseller list, and even our shelves were starting to just reflect our world a little bit. Like, there were times in 2018, 2019 where the bestseller list was 50%. BIPOC authors, where queer books were hitting the list with more regularity. And Loving and Other Filters was the first contemporary novel by a Muslim to hit the New York Times bestseller list on my site. And that was, also you're like, what, 2018? That seems like a long time, but I definitely think you have to find the right home for it. But right now, because of a combination of like censorship and book bans, and honestly, book talk, you'll see like right now the YA list is predominantly white fantasies. And fantasies written by white authors. White fantasy sounds like a weird. And a lot of them are based on like, that sort of classic fantasy mode. I mean, I'm not against fantasy. I wrote 2 middle grade fantasies, and we have friends that write fantasy, and we read fantasy. But that also reflects who publishers are putting marketing money behind, and also who the audience is kind of being receptive to right now, and what feels maybe safe, I guess. Because like in places like, for example, I was just in Georgia, and a teacher there was fired because Georgia is a right-to-work state, which is a weird phrase, which basically means they have no unions. And a teacher there, who had been teaching for a number of years, was fired. The grade school teacher was fired for reading this picture book called "My Shadow is Purple," or "The Color of My Shadow is Purple." I don't remember the exact title, something like that. Which is basically about this child seeing their shadow, and it's like a different color, seemingly, than everyone else's shadow, and they just are coming to grips with and joyful about the fact that their shadow is purple. Now, that's what the book is, the picture book. There's only 300 words. I've given you like 100 other words. So, but basically, you can understand some metaphor for this child maybe being different than normative. They were fired for reading that book out loud in their classroom. And so I think we see, like, publishing follows trends, and like trends follow sort of like zeitgeist. You know, it's like a combination of things. That doesn't mean that publishers still aren't publishing books. Like, our books are still getting published. They're still acquiring books. I just think that right now is a very tough time.
Yeah. I jokingly say, like, oh my goodness, I am in the wrong, industry, not industry, but like, I'm writing in the wrong category. When you see, like, this fantasy book sold for $50 million, and I'm like, I shouldn't be a fantasy writer. But, like, something keeps drawing me back to contemporary at the end of the day. And I'm curious for you what that is, that despite the, you know, all the shouting about fantasy and romantasy, like, why contemporary?
I like to say that I like to write the world as it is so that we can imagine the world as it could be. And I guess I gravitate towards contemporary stories because I'm interested in those young people who are making mistakes. I'm interested in how young people are forming their politics as teenagers. I'm interested in how the pressures of the world around them are like made manifest in the decisions that they're making. And you know, I guess, I don't know, like, you've written 2 contemporary books and you're writing another one.
For me, I think, like, when I was younger, I was always drawn to contemporary because that, like, I was a kid who moved around a lot, and, like, books were my only source of, like, constant. And so for some reason, the contemporary stories made me feel less lonely because I'm like, this could happen, versus when I'm reading fantasy, and I love fantasy, don't get me wrong. Like, a part of me is like, this will never happen. Like, it just is like, there's
I
just
could 100%
like,
never survive any fantasy.
yes, I would just totally be out within the
yeah,
first, like, 50 pages. So I think it's like a comfort thing too. Also, as a writer, I like just knowing the rules of something. Like, I'm like, this is the real world. This is how this works. Da 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 da. And I can focus, like, on the relationships.
Yeah, I mean, the world building is different.
World building is so hard for me, and I
you
like
do world building in this.
But, like,
And
I'm
you do a
talking
good
about
job.
magic systems,
Yes, you
and
don't
like
have to
that.
do that.
I bow down to people who have that. Who
Or
have
creating
that
languages,
Yes,
or maps.
I don't have that skill set. I'm just kind of like, I have this person. What is their problem?
Yeah.
Let's talk about it. Versus, like, you got to do that and build a whole kingdom over here. Like,
Right. That's why their books are twice as long as ours.
that is true.
Yeah, there's a question back here.
Yeah, so how do you guys decide to go from like coming of age, go from like YA to like young adult? Because like a lot of contemporary, well, not a lot of it, but contemporary I like is mostly coming of age, and I feel like after reading We Deserve Monuments, like that story could be very much, 25-year-old going through the same thing. So how do you decide, like, oh, my character's going to be 17 or 16 versus, writing something similar for somebody who's maybe slightly older one who's like 17?
I love this question because I ask myself,
Did everyone hear
this. The question is, like, how to determine, like, a coming-of-age story.
Like, is the character 17 or 25? Because that can also...
That's a really great point, because I just wrote a book where the character is 29, and it's still, to me, I'm like, this is a coming-of-age book, and this person is just, she's coming of age, and she's like, her impending 30th birthday is giving her some anxiety, and I'm like, to me still, like, that's coming of age. And I think that I'm kind of guilty in this, and that like sometimes, like I don't know, I felt almost bad like when we were in the process of writing, like editing this book, because I hear a lot of young people say like, oh, YA isn't for us anymore. Like these books are too old, and they're too, these are like 25-year-olds in 17-year-old bodies. And I felt bad because I felt like I was contributing to that problem. And so that's a fantastic question that I'm still working out, is to like determine why this story for this person. With We Deserve Monuments in particular, I knew I wanted to write about 3 generations of women, and so that naturally ended up being a girl, her mom, and her grandmother. And Avery is 17, and I wanted to explore like that moment when you realize your parents and your grandparents are just people. And I think to a lot of us that is a heartbreaking moment, because if you've been really privileged, you grew up thinking, oh, your parents have all the answers, or grandparents have all the answers, and then there's a moment when you see their traumas unfold and you realize, oh, they don't. Like, they're just people. And, like my family in particular, has dealt with addiction and like a lot of the things that pop up in my books. And I'm like, oh, because these are issues that my parents faced when they were my age, that just, they've never been solved and never been dealt with. And so I think it just is a matter of like listening to your stories, because I did have somebody ask me when I was writing Monuments, they were like, are you sure this isn't the grandma story? Because that's a whole, if you read the book, there's a lot going on there. But I was like, no, I think it's Avery's story. But for Thirsty, somebody at another event asked me like, well, what comes next? Because the book ends when she's a freshman in college, and I'm like, oh, I could easily write more books about it, because like struggling with drinking when you're in college, that's a multi-book thing. But I think also it's logistics of publishing saying like, we don't do YA, like, what is it, like, I feel like even 19 is pushing it.
Used to be a new adult, yes.
Used to be.
Yeah, used to be. That category, yeah. So there's so many, that's a great question, and I think so a couple things. So I believe that every single novel, regardless of who it's written for, every novel is a coming-of-age story and every novel is a mystery. That's how I approach sort of my literature worldview. Because I do think, like, even the middle-age novel is also something about confronting a coming-of-age. Yeah. So that's like one thing, we'll put that aside. But then this criticism of YA right now, because a lot of our YA, and we write 17-year-old characters, it's a little different in contemporary versus like high fantasy, because the language we're using is like pretty much everyday language. But I think there's the question of like, where's the YA with 14-year-old characters and 15-year-old characters? And then where is the new adult with a 21-year-old or a 22-year-old? There are more like, there's more, I think, books in the just after college range, but there is this sort of like 18 to 22-year-old where a lot of stuff happens.
Publishers are like, we don't know what to do with this. They don't want to touch it.
It's a weird categorical issue with essentially marketing. I mean, young adult is essentially a marketing tool, that term, right? I mean, like, for example, when Catcher in the Rye came out, people weren't calling it young adult. That's literally what it is. That term wasn't really used in the same way. Sometimes people were calling it teen books, or like Hemingway's like Nick Adams stories. Like some of those stories are when he's pretty young, or like a teenager. No one's calling those young adult. So it was really a marketing term or label that got affixed to it. And now we do know that a big chunk of YA readers are actually 18 to 35-year-olds. And I think it's happening, or maybe older. I'm older than that. I think YA. I mean, look, I think YA is actually for everybody. But the idea is that anyone can read YA. The characters are teens, and they should reflect the experience of teens. And I think one of the big differences is ideas of how young people can reflect and look back in hindsight, and it's different than the way a 35-year-old would do that. Yeah.
So if a character is 17, that doesn't necessitate YA. Your story.
No, it doesn't necessarily. I mean, because we've seen books that are written for the adult fiction market where there's a young person as the main character.
Yeah.
right? But that often can be like it's written sort of in hindsight, and I think hindsight is very different from YA.
Like Jasmine Ward, when you're thinking about like Salvage
Yes.
the Bones, I think that main character is like 13 or 14, but it is definitely an adult literary fiction novel. So yeah, it's about tone, intended audience, and voice. I think.
Yeah, voice
too.
is a big part of it.
Voice is a big part of it too.
You know, being of a certain profile, capture the voice of someone who's not in your profile. You know, if you're a middle-aged woman, I wrote a book and I have a white teenage protagonist. And part of my struggle, I submitted to one agent and they're like, we don't think you captured the voice of young adults and teenagers. So it's a triple whammy because I'm a middle-aged black woman and my main character is a teenage white Latino. And so capturing all those nuances has been a big struggle. And also I'm thinking maybe I haven't written YA. Maybe I've actually written more like an allegory. So how do you capture those?
Well, I'm a middle-aged person writing teenagers, so I think that, I think it's really important to just understand who your character is before you write them and understand what their voice is going to be. And that doesn't mean, like, my teens, I avoid, like, quote-unquote slang because I think it sounds totally weird coming out of a middle-aged person's mouth and putting it into a teen mouth in a way that is already going to be dated by the time it comes out. Especially, if I was writing, say, like a historical novel with a teenager from like the 1950s, it would be very different because terminology is going out much faster now because we live in a digital age versus like, I don't know, the terms that might have been used like in...
That's already baked in.
Yes.
Then, but now it's
Yeah.
not.
I think it's important to try to... It's a really tough question. I feel like I don't have like a prescriptive answer, but honoring the voice of your character is really important. And so trying to essentially put aside your own adult experience and allowing this teen character to live in what would be a teen mindset by whether it's making mistakes or that kind of thing, I think is really important. Like, how would a teen react to a situation versus an adult? And like, teens don't have filters in the way that we do, and things are very liminal for young people, right? It's very on the surface. Emotions, small things can be drama.
I love that.
I do too. It's interesting.
Yeah, and I think too, like, are you reading in the category in which you're trying to write? Because I think that for me, like, I read YA, like, because I write this and I need to know, like, what's being published right now. And also I think that just makes you a better writer, is understanding your market and understand, like, I would never go out and be like, I'm going to write a historical fiction because, like, I rarely read that and I wouldn't know where to start. So I think the best thing I would advise is, like, make sure you're reading, like, currently like, if it's contemporary, like, contemporary YA that's being published in the last 5 years is probably, like,
That's a good
biggest,
that's good.
the biggest help. And I think we have time for one more question and see.
What was your favorite YA book as a child?
You're asking me to narrow down.
I know,
Which is
sorry.
my favorite child? I loved this book called Jason and Kyra by Dana Davidson. It's just a very sweet love story between two black teenagers, and it was a salve for me when I was a teenager because it was very white in the publishing landscape at the time, like Sarah Dessen. That was like her heyday, like Gossip Girl, that kind of stuff. So seeing this sweet, tender black love story was just like, and it's called Jason and Kyra, if you have never read it. I've heard of it.
Well, I was a teenager in the 80s. We didn't really have YA in this sense, not in the way that it exists now, and there was also definitely no character. There's very, very few characters of color, but I guess I was a big reader, and so like I started reading. Judy Blume is the author that I carried with me from 4th grade probably through high school. I think there's some nods in the audience because yes. Because I started reading like her 4th grade characters, and then Are You There Got to Meet Margaret, and then I graduated to Deanie.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
In fact, the last name of Blake her last name is Brenner, and that's because of a Judy Blume character.
Oh my god!
And Blubber.
Oh my
The
gosh!
girl, the last name is Brenner, so that's why I was like.
That is so cute. So I think Judy Blume is the author that really, I loved her since I was in 4th grade. And I read her through high school. And then it was the 80s, so we were reading inappropriate things in high school. We were reading, is anyone else from the 80s like reading B.C. Andrews? Like, why were we reading What's your favorite book?
In YA.
Or any?
Well, like in the YA general area, I like Inheritance Games. It's actually about a character called, with the first name Avery.
Yeah.
Avery Kylie Grahams, who suddenly goes from living in her car to becoming like a multi-billionaire.
Yeah.
Like, not even to describe it, but that's like describing it on a low level.
Yeah.
Like,
There's all these puzzles and like
Yeah.
it's a very cool series. I also have read that series.
Thank you all so much for hanging out.